We are online.
Good morning and welcome to everybody to this event organized by the Diplomacy Festival 2020. The event is titled The EU Response to the Pandemic Toward the United States of Europe. As we say among economists, the pandemic is a common shock to all countries, unfortunately far from being over. A common shock that triggered a response by both individual countries and European institutions. A response from which it might be possible to start thinking about more ambitious projects of coordination and integration for Europe. This is the issue that we will discuss this morning. The event is jointly organized by the Diplomacy Festival in partnership with three institutions: the representation of the European Commission in Italy, the Italian Office of the European Parliament, and the Faculty of Economics of the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. I am a faculty member at the Università Cattolica, professor of public finance, and today I have the task with my talk to introduce the discussion. The organizers also asked me to moderate the discussion. Together with me are some colleagues from the academia and representative of European institutions. Let me present the other speakers, applying a rigorous alphabetical order. I start from Brando Benifei, a member of the European Parliament, but most important in my view for our talk today, a member of the INCO committee, the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, which is responsible for legislative oversight and scrutiny of EU rules on the single market, including the digital single market, customs and customer protection. Massimo Bordignon is joining us. He's also a professor of public finance at the Faculty of Economics of the Università Cattolica, a friend and a colleague. More important, a member of the European Fiscal Board. Just for students present here, the Fiscal Board is an independent advisory board on fiscal matters of the EU Commission, set up in October 2015, following the 5 President report on completing Europe's economic and monetary union. The board's role, I'm taking this from the official website of the board, is to evaluate the implementation of EU fiscal rule, to advise the Commission on the fiscal stance appropriate for the euro area as a whole, and to cooperate with member states' national fiscal councils. Then we have Enrique Guerrero. He's head of the Department for European Policy and the Study of Democracy at the Danube University in Krems, and also the director of the European Democracy Lab, an intergenerational think tank founded in 2014 to build a new European narrative after the division created by the sovereign debt crisis and the refugee crisis. Last but not least, Gustavo Piga, a professor of economics at the Faculty of Economics, Tor Vergata University. He very recently authored a book, L'Interregno, in Italian. It can be translated, I guess, in the Middle Kingdom in English. The Middle Kingdom is the one in which we are living today, after the international financial crisis starting in 2007 in the USA, landed in Europe, and brought about divisions among European countries. He proposes in this book a third way between abandoning the euro and building up immediately the United States of Europe. As you can see, the panel is quite rich, and I'm sure the discussion will be fruitful and interesting. But let me now set the stage and present my own view of this issue. I will argue that building a federation of countries works as a commitment device to avoid trade wars by means of tariffs and competitive devaluation of the exchange rates. This is why building a federation takes a long time. The making of the United States of America is a clear example. As Hugh Grokoff, an American economic historian at Rutgers University Department of Economics, puts it, throughout the first 150 years of the US monetary union, at least, the United States was racked repeatedly by bitter regional disputes over monetary policies and institutions. Building federation is not an easy political task and requires time. The starting point in building my argument is clearly the brutal COVID-19. I believe that without the virus, the kind of discussion that would have prevailed in Europe in this year 2020 was going to be much different. With respect to what we are instead discussing now. Back in late May 2019, when the elections for the European Parliament took place, all the EU leaders were somewhat scared by the populist tide that was mounting across Europe, but that in the end did not flood Europe. The discussion during the electoral campaign here in Italy was about removing fiscal rules at the EU level. This was the dream of Italian populist parties, not of all populist parties in Europe, though, if they were to win elections and to have a majority in the European Parliament. This has not happened. In Italy, the discussion starting after the election took place was about how to respect fiscal rules with the new budget law, given the risk of a procedure and the bad situation of public finances. The Italian government also received a set of recommendations from Brussels and advice from the Commissions, suggesting that the country is not projected to comply with the debt reduction benchmark in 2019 and 2020. And most observers were expecting a new exam in April 2020. Nothing really good for European integration and for the electoral polarization in the country. But December 31st, 2019 was when most people were making their wish list for the new year. The WHO country office in the People's Republic of China picked up a media statement by the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission from their website on cases of viral pneumonia in Wuhan. These are the words used by the WHO in their websites. The new coronavirus entered our lives. I'm not going to make any new announcement on how many people have been infected so far, how many have already died, how many required to be hospitalized in intensive care units. This is part of our daily life, unfortunately. Lockdown starting in March here in Italy was real pain and difficult to understand at the beginning in other European countries. I was worried, and as many others, by these extreme containment measures. Everything was really uncertain. And in the first few days, I have seen real panic with people assaulting stores to buy as much as possible given the stay-at-home order. Listening of other countries locking their borders with Italy, like Austria and Slovenia, was also scary. If borders close, goods cannot move. The EU response was real and effective. Despite I am a public economist, I'm not discussing here about the funds that each member state and Europe are making available. There is a bit of discussion in Italy about the European Stability Mechanism and the differences with the Next Generation EU. Brando Benifei and Massimo Bordignon will present in a while their own view on this specific issue. I will also not discuss about the actions taken by the European Central Bank with the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, which are clearly of paramount importance in this phase. What I'd like to mention here are those actions taken by the Commission that are most probably unknown to most citizens, or that people do not seem to understand, or they not give importance to, because they appear to them obvious, but are not at all obvious. Let me take the words used by the President von der Leyen in her State of the Union address on 16 September 2020. When member states closed borders, we created green lanes for goods. When some countries introduced export bans for critical medical goods, we stopped that and ensured that critical medical supply could go where it was needed. We worked with European industry to increase the production of masks, gloves, tests, and ventilators. Our civil protection mechanism ensured that doctors from Romania could treat patients in Italy, or that Latvia could send masks to its Baltic neighbors. And we achieved this without having full competencies. I think all of these sentences suggest a clear role in terms of coordination of member state policies for EU. And there is a clear consensus that we need more coordination in the response to the virus at the EU level. But my point here today is that these sentences also bring back to the stage a construction that in our long, painful discussion about the future of the euro in recent years, we almost took for granted, the internal market. Let me elaborate a bit further on this issue, which I believe is central in the discussion to come. Thinking to the internal market suggests to take a long-run perspective when discussing about building a more coordinated and a more integrated Europe. It brings us back to the end of the 50s to the Treaties of Rome. As far as I have been taught, as far as I can understand as a European citizen born at the beginning of the 70s, the aim of the treaties was to eliminate trade barriers between member states, to increase economic prosperity and contribute to the ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. Why trade barriers? Consider an economic downturn in one country. To make national goods more competitive, a government can impose tariffs on imported goods. This is exactly what the USA have done, for instance, with the Smooth-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, as a response to the economic crisis following the collapse of the stock market in 1929. The problem is that following a beggar thy neighbor kind of policy, many other countries increased their tariffs, exacerbating the crisis and the imbalances which then brought it in a chain of causality to the Second World War. It is astonishing that in recent years, we have seen again, during a severe economic downturn, the resurgence of protectionist policies. As for the decision of European countries, the Treaties of Rome was clearly, in my view, a way to avoid making a war, as in the past, to solve economic imbalances in their economies. There is, however, another mechanism that allows countries to solve internal economic problems during a downturn, the exchange rate. Competitive currency devaluation is again a means to make internally produced goods cheaper on the internal markets. which, turning back to the US examples in the 30s, is exactly what Roosevelt did under the Gold Reserve Act. We can read the making of the euro along these lines. With the goal to promote monetary stability in the continent, European countries agreed on the European monetary system in 1979. This exchange rate regime was built on the concept of stable but adjustable exchange rates. Currency fluctuations were limited. More important, exchange rates could only be changed by mutual agreement between participating member states and the European Commission. The European monetary system allowed currency devaluations, but only if agreed by member states. This regime was in place till 1999, when the single currency was launched. The euro was a reality by 2002. Life was not easy so far for the single currency. The euro has experienced a number of economic downturns since it was born. The dot-com bubble burst in 2000. It was followed by accounting scandals like the Enron scandal, not to mention September 11, 2001. Then the real estate bubble burst in 2006 in the US, causing the subprime mortgage crisis in 2007. Europeans did quarrel during these difficult times, suspending and then reforming the Stability and Growth Pact between 2003 and 2005. But we had not seen almost any effects on interest rates differentials, even when Greece was discovered to have misreported financial data. The reason for this is, in my view, because financial market beliefs were interpreting the euro as the common currency of a federation of countries. This belief came to an end after France and Germany met in Deauville in October 2010. The sovereign debt crisis was served, and only the ECB president, promising to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, was able to buy time and solve the crisis. Now, remember what kind of policies countries were used to choose to revitalize their economies during a downturn in the presence of a weak internal demand: tariffs and competitive devaluations. None of this was available for EU countries because of the internal market and because of the euro. European countries decided to make fiscal rules even more complicated in response to all these crises. The containment of public deficit and debt and these harsh fiscal rules provoked strong opposition to Europe and the rise of populist parties in many countries. Then came the virus, and now we are telling a different story. The reason for this is because we are experiencing a health shock before a huge economic shock. Health of our similarly is touching us, brings solidarity to the fore. This does not mean we will make it. This does not mean we will progress toward the United States of Europe. It just makes it likely again. Let me go back to President von der Leyen's words to conclude. The future will be what we make it, and Europe will be what we want it to be. This is my take of it. Let me now turn, I think I was longer than expected, to Brando Benifei, a member of the European Parliament. The Parliament is discussing those days about the next generation EU. I think we can learn a lot from listening his talk. Mr. Benifei, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss in the context of this festival about topics we have been working on a lot in these months, where we can say that the pandemic has brought us to a new degree of understanding of the need of a stronger, more efficient, with a higher capacity of taking decisions at the level of the challenges that we have for the European Union that we have built in these decades, but that today and in the last years has proved not very well equipped with the way it works to confront with the challenges that we have seen, that I was mentioning, the pandemic and its consequences, both from a health perspective, but also from a economic, social, and democratic perspective. I would like to talk about the topic we are discussing today, the issue of the perspective and the idea of a United States of Europe, or anyway of a federal union of the EU, through two different angles. One is my point of view as a 6-year already MEP. I've been elected in 2000 2014 and re-elected in 2019. Today, I'm the head of delegation, we can say the leading MEP of my political party, the Democratic Party in Italy, and I've been for 6 years, 6 years and a half, an MEP already, and I've come to some degree of understanding, at least from my point of view, of why we are in a situation where today we see, looking at for example, at the data of the Eurobarometer in Italy, a discrepancy between a growth of Euroscepticism, but at the same time, at very high level of positive answers, when citizens are asked in this periodical poll about the opinions of the Europeans. In Italy, you see, in my country, that I take as an example, you see a very high degree of positive responses when people are asked, do you want a more integrated social Europe? Do you want a European defense? Do you want a real European foreign policy? It's interesting to see that the answers are very positive, while there is a growth of Euroscepticism. And I want to explain why, in my opinion, it's like that, and what is the EU of today, in my view, seeing it from inside. And then why I see a space for a path towards this building now of a proper federal union, a kind of United States of Europe. First point, so, is what is it today? Well, today the EU is a context of is a supranational institution where we see, in my opinion, a dysfunctional decision-making system. It's a system that was conceived in a totally different moment, where both institutionally and politically the situation was very, very different. And we see this weakening and these difficulties not just with the pandemic. We have seen it in the last years to take decisions on some important topics, on issues regarding the reform of the Eurozone, issues regarding migration that has been so much at a heated debate, decisions on fiscal rules, decisions on issues regarding the external dimension of the EU. Why is it like that? Because the way the EU decides today is based on a system where we have the European Parliament, and on one end that I represent, and on the other hand we have the Council of the member states. The Council is, we can say, the other chamber of the legislative work of the Union. But it's not a real legislative chamber, it's a diplomatic body where most of the work is done by diplomats. And the political level is involved in a very complex way, but in a way that sidelines, in my opinion, the way of deciding of a proper legislative body. So the tendency in Council, that is the other, many of you know because of your studies, of your work, it's the, as I said, it's the other legislative chamber of the EU with many brackets on that. It's, however, a very peculiar body. It is a place where there is always a tentative to find consensus, not to it's not considered the usual way of doing, to just vote like we do in the Parliament. We don't wait for everyone to be agreeing, okay? While the Council, even when they can decide by majority, they try to not decide by majority. And also, at least in many cases, and we have seen it also in some of the examples I just made about the topics where the EU was stuck. And also, there is a tendency to accept the fact that there might be some exchanges between single member states, like covering each other on topics that are very difficult for one or the other. Like for one might be the fiscal rules, for another one might be the migration, and in the end we take years to take decisions. This has been my experience, that the Council, unlike what we hear very often in the public debate, is not true that decides without the European Parliament. This is very important, I think, to clarify, because sometimes we hear very often that, well, in the EU, the member states decide all alone, and the Parliament is weak. I don't really agree with this kind of analysis that we hear very often in the media. The fact is that the member states, in every part of the decision making, and with the Treaty of Lisbon, with the last reform of the treaties, the strength of the European Parliament has increased, and so they have to take that into account in the legislative process. They prefer not to decide instead of taking a real stance and having to mediate with the European Parliament, because obviously to have a proper legislative piece from the European Union side, you need both institutions to be agreeing on a text. I've been myself, I was introduced as a member of the Internal Market Committee. A few days ago, I was in a trilogue, in a meeting of Commission, Council and Parliament to negotiate a final text on a legislative piece. I'm the rapporteur, the general rapporteur of the European Parliament, so I'm the negotiator for the single market program. That is one part of the multi-annual financial framework, the budget of the EU, regarding the functioning of the single market. Funds regarding various aspects of how we make our single market working better. So my point is the Council today is a big obstructionist body for the decision making of the EU, the Council of the Union. So what happens is that sometimes member states just decide to do things on their own without the communitarian method. They try to build things outside the EU today because the EU method, okay, of co-decision, because they cannot stand this way of working. And why is it like that? Why? Because, as I said earlier, institutionally and politically, the EU is not the one of the Maastricht period. We are still sticking to that kind of the EU that was born at the beginning of the 90s with successive decisions. But today we have institutionally, we have a larger EU. We have a EU that is much larger than at the time when the EU as today was conceived in terms of the enlargement. And we have unfortunately still a very weak integration of, for example, the countries that decided to have a common currency, they still don't have a common fiscal policy and limited economic governance. So we have this imbalance that created a more difficult environment to take decisions at council level when you need to have large majorities or more often unanimity with a larger number of countries with, and I want to also stress this, with different political environments. We have more nationalist governments that have an extractive attitude towards EU, that they don't want to advance in building a common integration. My impression, again, as a policymaker, is that it was not like that in the past. It was difficult always. There were different national interests. There were different contexts. But when in Austria there was a super nationalist government with Haider, there was an attitude to isolate it. Now, how would that be possible? It's not like that. We are in a different time where we have very nationalist governments that don't care about finding compromises and advancing the European agenda, only when they have a short-term electoral interest. And that's, I think, the most important concept. The EU, as it is built today, with this large number of states and with this much different political landscape than even just 15 years ago, is a decisional system that is favoring short-termism, looking at very short-term electoral interest that in the end blocks the way of deciding. Then it comes the pandemic, and I will quickly explain the second point I wanted to make, why now I see a space for unblocking this situation. Because the pandemic has shown that as it is today, the EU, even not just in the way of deciding that I try to analyze from my point of view, but also with the instruments that it had, it was not ready. It was not ready in terms of the health union. It was not ready in terms of the financial instruments. It was not ready in terms of the decision-making process that I talked about. So what started is a discussion that is, to some extent, as I said earlier, built outside the communitarian method, because Next Generation EU, in the end, is very much a state thing. It's not very much a communitarian thing with the full involvement of the EU Parliament. However, we have a crucial role to play, because everything, all the castle of this Next Generation EU is sitting on the EU budget. That is the guarantee for all the emissions of the common debt titles that you have obviously heard about. So the Parliament has full power on the negotiating of the budget, at least on the rules, and it's playing its role. But today we see that with this decision that was necessary in a context of extreme difficulty to finally have some degree, a kind of common debt with this emission of common titles for financing in the financial markets, the Next Generation EU, the decision to raise the limit of the own resources, which is the base for emitting this common debt, and the discussion going on creating new own resources for the EU. This means new fiscal policy at a common level in terms of own capacity of raising revenue, a taxation on the polluters that produce outside the EU and sell products produced in polluting more that would be allowed in the EU in our internal market. This is the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism. This, I think we will hear a lot about this, because this is a very, very important thing that we will be discussed in the next months. Then there is the digital tax. We all know about the debate about that. And also there is an ongoing discussion on the financial transaction tax, a long-term discussion that now is coming back on the table. So why I see, and I conclude on this, why I see now a space for building a path towards a federal union, that I try to explain why, how it is today, the EU. It's a very complex, undemocratic, because difficult to be understood by people. Sorry for being so blunt, but to some degree, it's like that. People don't understand it. It's too complicated. Council of the European Union, European Council, these are two different things. Just this makes it, it sounds like a joke, but it's true. And it's a way, it's the successive, we can say, adjustment of a project of integration that today needs a shake-up for it to be ready for what we are seeing. And this was, as I said, an understanding, at least from the Parliament side already, already before the pandemic. But now with the pandemic, with the building of a common debt, because we are doing it, we can build, as I said, a common fiscal policy, at least at the level of having own resources and a fiscal capacity of the EU that can pave the way for more reform. My final point is that I become convinced as a very, I have my own ideas. I'm a very, very much convinced European federalist. So I really believe in this perspective. But as I tried to have a critical view on what we have today and what we can do. And my conviction is that if we want to build, and I think it's desirable for the EU to have this path towards a federal union and the United States of EU, we need to build on the common debt fiscal capacity path that has been opened. Now we will have the conference on the future of Europe in the next months. There will be a larger moment for discussion, but I think that the opening, the space for finding a way to build a federal union is working on this decision to have a common debt, and in this way strengthen EU budget and building on the taxation made at EU level to sustain this in the future. So this is the way, I think, to the point where we can see an opening in a context that I tried to explain in these years has been quite difficult, quite incapable of taking important decisions, also because of its institutional way of working. So I hope that this way forward can bring also to a treaty change that we will fight for in the Conference on the Future of Europe, at least many of us in the European Parliament. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Benifei. I now turn to Massimo Bordignon. Massimo, are you here? Here you are. We cannot hear you. No way.
Massimo, problema del tuo microfono perché non sei mutato. Adesso sì, sei mutato. Ecco, adesso vai. No.
No, we cannot hear you. Can you try, Massimo, without your headphones? No way. Yes, now you're coming. Just try to unmute your mic.
Can you hear me or no?
Yes, now yes. So Massimo.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, usually I use this thing, so I had to shout a bit more. Thank you very much for the invitation. I do have some slide, if it's possible to put it on. So how do I do? Because now
push the green
share
button.
the screen.
You have to share your screen.
Share screen.
Yes.
Yeah, but now I have to find a way to get to the. Okay. Okay, can you see it?
Yes. Yeah, they are.
Okay, let me see if we can get. It's complicated. Okay. Now it seems to be working. Okay, so I mean, there is nothing particularly. I mean, I don't need the screen because there is any particularly thing which is important on the screen. But usually, my view is that people can follow me easier if I talk. They have something in front of them. So I mean, I think that you know, the way in which I would like to start is to give you my punchline, and then I try to work on this punchline. But so at least you have an idea where I want to go. If I don't manage to say all that I wanted to say. And I think that a good way to start is to quote this sentence by Jean Monnet that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which say that Europe will be forging crisis and will be the sum of the solution adopted for this crisis. Now, if you look at this sentence, there are two assumptions, implicit assumptions in this sentence. The first one is that the solution to a crisis will always go to lead to more political centralization. There is a crisis, will be an European response and therefore more Europe, and that the sum of solution of these different crises will produce some kind of a coherent package. I think that this is a possibility, but we have to be very careful because none of this point should be taken as granted in the case of the COVID crisis. And I really think that and hope that the EU response to the COVID crisis might indeed end up with a sort of a quantum leap toward more political integration, but it might also end up to stop the process. So the real question is, you know, which is which? What's going? I'm going to try to discuss a bit these things later on, when that we are moving in one direction rather than the other. The second is that we have to be worried is that it might not produce a coherent package. And I'll try to explain these things a bit more later on. But for example, the New Generation EU, which is this main big program which has been advanced to face the crisis, is actually now currently displacing the MFF, so the multi-annual financial forecast, which is the normal budget. And in a sense, the ECB policy, so the monetary policy, is displacing the NGEU. So we do have this kind of problem. On the other hand, I also think that the decision taken during this crisis have also put something like a period to a long debate. So I don't know how much we can enter, but there has been a long discussion about multiple speed Europe, on particularly Eurozone specific institution. And what I believe now is that in a sense, with the decision to go through the European budget, we in a sense stop this debate. So in a sense, the solution for the euro area in the future will be the solution we've taken at the European level, not with specific institution to the euro area. Okay, so this is my punchline. Let me work on that. I think that, Brando Benifei has already, in a sense, anticipated me. So this is also useful because, in a sense, you hear the same story twice. I think that the one good way to approach the reaction of the Europe to the crisis is realizing that in Europe, as it stands at the moment, there are actually two Europe. I mean, what I call the supranational euro and the intergovernmental euro. And what I mean with that, there are, as you know, a number of supranational European institutions, the European Commission, the European Parliament, the BCA, so on. Of course, these are very different institutions, but they have 2 points in common. The first, that they are able, even if there are conflicts, they are able to take decisions quite quickly. I mean, there is a voting rule, and people in majoritarian rule, and people can decide by simply voting. And the second thing, that these are really supranational institutions, in the sense that their ideal constituency is a sort of European citizenship. While if you look at the same time, we also have, and in a sense they are even more powerful, particularly in a number of fields, like, for example, fiscal policy, you have intergovernmental institutions, the Council in all his different representations, the European Council, the ECOFIN, the Eurogroup, and many institutions which are linked to these two. And what these are, these intergovernmental institutions? They are basically assembly of national politicians which are only accountable to a national constituency. So even when these people meet and discuss about Europe, they always come from a national position. They defend a national interest. And as Benifei was suggesting just before, I mean, the decision rule of this assembly at the end is the unanimity rule. In some cases, there are also rules according to which they can find a decision with a qualified majority. But as a matter of fact, this assembly, what they try to do is to bargain between them and to find some kind of most consensual solution. And just to make an example, since this has been discussed a lot in Italy, the European Stability Mechanism is a typical intergovernmental institution. It's owned by the country. I mean, the decisions are taken unanimity, is out of the European legislation, and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at what's happened with the crisis, you see that to face the COVID, I mean, there were two different kinds of answers. I mean, I think that the supranational institutions have been able to move quickly and overall coherently, in spite of the many distinction and division and even conflict which are inside any of these supranational institutions, from the BCA to the Commission to the Parliament. I cannot go through because it would take me too long, but I mean, the BCA, the European Central Bank did a number of things which should have been done. The Commission made use as much as it could his power. The Parliament supported the action of the Commission. There was the deactivation of the Stability and Growth Pact, the activation of legislation of state aid rule, the new use of structural funds, and so on and so forth. Okay. Instead, if you look to the intergovernmental institution, they managed to agree only with difficulty and through sharp conflict. Not only that, but because, I mean, there is unanimity and because basically there is veto power by all members, at the end the solution were found were compromised which worsened the original Commission proposal. So, for example, if you look at what happened in July, in order to approve the NIG, the New Generation Fund, which is, let me remind you, I'm coming back to that, a temporary mechanism, we were introduced a number of serious cuts in the EU budget, which is the permanent, which is a permanent structure. And what we cut things like Horizon research, we cut things like Erasmus, so it means mobility, we cut things like, for example, defense or many other common public goods. And we also introduce, even to find this agreement, even more distortion in the funding mechanism. I mean, I don't know exactly if you, how you are familiar or how the European budget is financed, but you know, that was the occasion in which everybody was expecting we could read of the rebates, which are distortion with respect to the normal rule according to which country should contribute to the European budget, because now finally the UK was not there, which was the origin of all this rebate. Instead, what's happened, we introduce even more rebates, even more distortion. And let me remind you that at the moment, an agreement between the Parliament and the Council on the budget and on an NGEU is still pending, creating the possibility of delay in spite of the fact that we see that the pandemic is accelerating, there are more debt and so on. So that is the system. Let me also say, but perhaps I can skip this because we can discuss later on, and we do also have a German panelist, so she can tell us much more than I can tell you. We will not have reached this result, which is still, I believe, to be a potential historical solution. That is one that can introduce a potential structural break in the evolution of the European Union if it was not for the Germany. The country, Germany, change its position for a number of reasons, which I think mostly because, well, I could call it enlightened self-interest, the understanding by the current German leadership that without a common response, the COVID might also lead to a dissolution of the European Union, thus threatening the long-term interests of Germany itself. But why I'm telling you that this is a potential historical solution, okay? Let me go step by step. First of all, this new fund, the NGEU, but this is true also for the SURE mechanism, goes through the EU budget. And the European budget is the lossy, I mean, the place where traditionally redistribution across country is acceptable. Why this has been proved to be impossible in intergovernmental sector. So in an intergovernmental setting, I mean, country, you cannot really argue for a redistribution from one country to the other. If you build a supranational budget, then like the European budget, then you can say, well, okay, for cohesion reason, for a number of reasons, because I have to implement a number of common European policy, that can be also some redistribution across countries. The second reason why is because the solution requires the issue of common European debt to finance new tools. So we now are producing European debt. These are not the famous Euro bonds, which we'll be discussing a lot for a number of reasons, in which I do not enter, but however is common European debt, which will remain on the budget of the European Union. Finally, the NGEU funds are at least partially conditioned to finance, to promote truly European public goods, like the Green Deal, digitalization, and so on. Finally, it's even possible, and Brando was suggesting that before, it's even possible this new debt will be paid in the future with new own taxes at the EU level, and not with an enhanced contribution by member states. So if you look at what's happening is with the NGEU, seems like that we have been moving in the direction of introducing a truly federal budget that, if we need it, can run anti-cyclical fiscal policy by raising debt backed by its own resource, because it has tax resource. It can implement European policy, might also redistribute among member states. This federal budget would, in my view, kill several birds with a stone. First of all, it would overcome the main source of incompleteness of the European Monetary Union. We have been discussing this for 20 years, really. And the basic point is that we have built a strange kind of monetary union, in which monetary policies decide commonly. There is a common monetary policy. We have only one central bank, but we have a decentralized common fiscal policy, except for fiscal rules, but they are debt break. They are not really a common fiscal policy. So, and this we have shown, we have been seen that it doesn't really work, okay? The second thing is that through this European debt, we would introduce a safe asset at the European level. I mean, an asset where, you know, people could invest, which is safe in the sense that, you know, if there is something like a crisis or whatever, people will go invest there. And one thing that we have understood that is very difficult to, you know, complete the European Monetary Union with the banking and capital union, or even reinforcing the international role of the euro if we do not have a safe asset. And finally, obviously, if we have this step toward a federal budget, I mean, to maintain a democratic legitimacy, in the medium term, this will also force necessarily a revision of the treaty in the direction and Benifei was suggesting before, strengthening supranational institutions, the EU Parliament, to the detriment of intergovernmental one. I mean, if you move this power, even the power of tax, the power of spend, you give more autonomy at the European level, then you have to increase democratic legitimacy, which means that you have to make the parliament, you know, more powerful in the structure. Remember, no taxation without representation. So, I mean, if we move more power, even taxing power at the European level, then we have to make sure that the people who are there really represent the society. But let me say that, so this is an opportunity. It's true. I mean, we are in an opportunity in which maybe not I mean, perhaps the European, how we say, we are not going to become like the US. I mean, we're not going to be an European a common state of Europe, but certainly we could make strong step toward more political integration, okay? But still, I mean, this is a possibility, a federal solution, but it is not said, I mean, it's not obvious that we go there. We will see what's happened. And let me just remind you a few things. First, a number of these tools, like the NG, EU, and the SURE, are really temporary tools, okay? And, you know, they are temporary means that they last only a few years, and then they should, in theory, disappear, and we should go back to the previous situation, okay? And the allocation of this fund has been distorted to signal this temporariness. I mean, for example, I mean, if you take the money from the NG EU, these are money for investment, a lot of money, but you are supposed to spend it very quickly in just a few years. Why? Because you want to signal that this is an exceptional thing. Exceptional because linked to the crisis and not that. Not only, but as I told you, in a sense, these temporary excess funds have been displaced the permanent spending. I mean, there have been a reduction in the EU budget, the normal budget, which has been going on for several decades. You know, we have this kind of contradiction. Monetary policy now are reducing the price of, you know, the interest rate that you had to pay on your national bonds, and this is, on the other hand, reduce then the convenience of using the NG SURE. So, for example, Spain has said, well, maybe I'm not sure that I'm going to use this loan. This is a mistake. But why is it a mistake? Because the point is to try to face this crisis not only with monetary policy, but also with fiscal policy. And of course, you know, if it is not said that the European Central Bank is going to buy national bonds forever. Why an European bond, of course, it would be much easier to buy an European bond. So things. And, you know, I think that the basic point, I mean, so when is that we are going to decide if this tool then become permanent, or so we make some irreversible step toward an European federal budget, or we go back? I think it very much depends on if they work or they don't work. I mean, and I think it is impose a heavy responsibility of the country which benefit more from this policy, and particularly on Italy, because Italy is the country which is going to benefit more from these funds, and is also the laggard of Europe. So I think that if there is going to be more convergence, if these things are shown to be work, then public opinion will move toward more support for the European things, and this step can take place. Other thing that, however, I think there is going to be a long-term consequence. I mean, there has been a long discussion this decade in which I have participated myself, say, well, come on, we cannot go on like that. Institution for the euro area particularly are not the right one. We had to make some step forward, like introducing specific institution, a ministry for the euro area, a treasury, whatever. I don't know how much familiar you are with this debate, but we have been discussing these things for at least a decade. And I'm thinking that now, from now on, I think this debate is how do you say, stop, in the sense that the decision to issue debt at the level of the European budget, and so having all these institutional mechanisms working in that direction, making possible, I think, to go on with this different kind of debate. So let me finish with two small points, which I said instead of a conclusion, because rather than concluding, I want just to give you these two quick things. The first is that you know, the resurgence of the pandemic at the moment, unfortunately, the situation is worse than we thought and we hoped. Probably Europe is going to enter in a second recession instead of having a big recovery in 2021. We will see how these things work, in the sense that this might push countries even to stay more together. And there are signals in those directions. I really hope that this happens. But unfortunately, it might even work in the different direction. It might undermine the union, particularly if some country start saying, well, I want to solve the problem on my own, particularly rich country. And the second thing, I mean, and this I very much agree with the position that Brando Benifei was supporting before. One thing that we have learned in this case, that the European project cannot really go on with unanimity rule, veto power, and whatever. So we need to find some step forward. But to make some step forward, you know, toward a political federation, we also have to find some institutional mechanisms which protect small and rich countries, the frugal one, that would have otherwise lose power. I think that all the discussion that we had this summer about frugal country, whatever, somehow is misplaced. Frugality is not about money, it's about power. It's the fact that if you move towards some kind of federal solution, small country with a small population are maybe rich, so the one that might have to pay are going to lose power. And that's the deep fundamental reason why they are resisting all this kind of stuff. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you managed to follow me. Thank you.
Thanks, Massimo. We are somewhat late. You call Germany to the stage. We have Enrique Guerrero, Professor Guerrero. Here you are. We cannot hear you. I think you need to unmute the mic.
So now it should work.
Here you are. Okay.
I'm very thankful to talk to so many people in Italy. It's interesting in a Zoom to see all these students in all your rooms writing down what we are discussing. And I want to thank you for a very wonderful discussion. If I resume Gilberto, I resume Brando and Massimo in what you have been talking, we come to think that there is a serious problem in the institutional setup of the European Union as it stands now, which is that we are lacking fiscal union, we are lacking social union, and we have a deep crisis, and this was Brando's point, a deep crisis of representation. And on all these 3 points, I would like to add a couple of things and speak to you roughly 15 minutes. But in doing so, I would also like to share a couple of charts with you. So if you could give me the screen, then perhaps I could do so. Bildschirm freigeben. Okay, so now. So you heard a lot, all the students heard a lot from Gilberto about the flip sides of monetary union and of lacking fiscal and social convergence. And I think it's very interesting, and the state of the art, the State of the Union speech by Ursula von der Leyen has already been mentioned, and I invite you all to read this speech. It's a thrilling speech, it's a very good speech, And what von der Leyen does is to point to Next Generation Europe, but to make precisely the point that we will need to increase the social pillar, that we will need to look at European citizens, that we will need to change the democratic setup of the European Union. And this is really new language for Next Generation Europe in the European Union. And it's very important because what we are seeing, and I think what I'm going to say now is basically including the analysis of Gilberto, it's including the analysis of Brando and of Massimo, that we need to look at all these flip sides of lack of fiscal union, social union, and crisis of representation through the same lenses, which essentially means that we have not formula, no representation, no taxation without representation in the European Union. So we have a deep deficit of legitimacy, and the deep deficit of legitimacy can be boiled down to the very condition of a democracy, which is always no taxation without representation. And this is the principle that actually the European Union does not yet have. So now, we have been talking a lot, it has been mentioned in what has been said before me, that we have a rescue package now on the table, and the rescue is 750 billion. It has been hardly disputed. I'm very proud, at least, that my country, Germany, for this time was not among the frugal force, but it was the tinier countries like Austria, the Netherlands, and so. But beyond that, I think it's very important to stress that what we are doing is not yet Euro bonds or Corona bonds or sort of big debt mutualization. But what we are doing here, and this is essential, is that we are converging interest rates. Because as of today, Germany is lending roughly at 5 interest rates at financial markets, and Italy is lending at so if you need a lot of money at financial markets to get your recovery of the economy ready after the pandemic, it makes a huge difference whether you are lending at 0.5 as Germany or 2.5 like Italy. And this is why the European Union decided in this July summit to have common lending and then to distribute the money among European countries. The real question is this what has been called a Hamiltonian moment? Yes or not? Hamiltonian moment means, and Gilberto has mentioned the history of the United States, means basically an entry, having a foot in the door for future nation of debt, but it means an increase of fiscal spending, more precisely an increase of cross-border fiscal spending. I brought you a quotation from a German newspaper, which I will just read in a second. The moment the EU can generate its own income on a large scale, it gains an independence that only the nation states in Europe have so far. It would be on the way to becoming a state. There are people like German Finance Minister Scholz who expressively support such a far-reaching decision should be made casually in an economic crisis, however bad it is. So I brought you this quotation to make the following point. Nikolaus Busse from Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which is a conservative journal, a very important national but conservative journal, basically talks about Europe becoming a state ex negativo. Basically what he says is if the European Union wants to do what it wants to do, which is fiscal transfer cross-border, having the rescue package and doing fiscal and social stability, having fiscal convergence, it should have a reflection on becoming a state. So now Nikolaus Busse is saying we don't have this discussion. But I argue, and that's why I brought you the book on the right hand, La question de l'État européen for those who read French. But Jean-Marc Ferry is one of the most important philosophical thinkers of European integration in France. And this book is from the year 2000. And it has been written in the run-up for the European Constitutional 2003. Today know that we have been basically hardly before a European constitutional making in 2003, which then failed because of a French no, a Dutch no, and then many other reasons, also American pressure and so on and so forth. But my point is that 20 years or 17 years after 2003, 17 years, we are basically still stuck in a discussion where we are talking, and we have been talking the whole morning with Brando, Gilberto, Massimo, about the necessity to cope with the fiscal and the social convergence of the European Union as a system, and to cope with the very fact that if we are truly reasoning about the European democracy, that we would need to apply the principle of taxation without that points precisely to the crisis of representation, with the council being the evil sort of part that Brando pointed out. So we have a crisis of representation because most of the decision-making of the European Union takes part in the council with co-decision, of course, but we are not having the principle of one voter, one voice, one person, one vote. We are 500 million citizens in the European Union, but we are represented in the European Parliament only with weighted votes, which means we are not corresponding to the principle one person, one vote, and we do not have the principle no taxation without representation. The problem with all these EU packages is that there is German taxpayers' money, which is done, or which is brought cross-border to Italy, to France, to Spain, without a German say of the German citizens on it. And this is the principle, no taxation without representation, which we need to break through, and getting away with the council, I think, is the way. Getting away with the council would mean that we shift the whole institutional system. And I'm very happy to talk to Italians, because this is not new at all, because there is the Declaration of Ventotene from 1944, which is already, and I invite you to look this document up, a very thrilling document about a European political system which is built up on citizens' representation. So now, if we are talking about citizens, about European citizens, and really to want to become really European citizens, then there is one simple thing. Citizens need a state. There's no such thing than a citizens without a state, and there's no such thing than a state without a citizen. We are talking enormously about the role of European citizens in these days. We are talking about the need of a social pillar. We are talking about the need of a European citizenship. Mrs. von der Leyen wants to have a conference on the future of the European Union, and she wants to consult the European citizen. I would rather argue that the citizens are not there to be consulted, because citizens are the sovereign. And so I brought you a quotation from Max Weber, who is a German sociologist, and he said in 1912, when he was asked, what is a nation? And essentially what Max Weber answered by then is, a nation means actually to create a state together. The moment of state making makes people becoming a nation, that we decide to live together for generations and to live with it. So now I took the liberty to take this Max and to apply it to what we are seeing in Europe today. I point you to the fact there is Alexandra von Western, a citizen fellow of Germany. She's living in Brussels and in London, and she's a lawyer. And she's actually suing the European Court of Justice, and I'm supporting her case, to intervene with the claim that European citizenship is of permanent status. I invite you to look at case 252/29. The argument runs as follows, and it points to many of the things that Gilberto, Bianco, and Massimo have touched upon. We are having a European Union which is built on the Maastricht Treaty and which is said to have two pillars. The European Union as of today is Union of States and Union of Citizens. Most of the decision making takes place in the Union of States, in the Council sort of proceeding. Now, Alexandra asked the European Court, if the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union at the end of the year with Article 50, does this mean that the British people, the British citizen, also lose immediately the European citizenship? And she asked the court to judge on this, and she says they should not, because the European Union is both Union of States and Union of Citizens. It could be that the Union of Citizens, of European citizens, is independent from the Union of States, which means that we could see that the UK as a state leaves the European Union, but the British citizen remain European citizens because citizenship cannot be given away, or European citizenship cannot be taken away by the United Kingdom, because granted by the European Union. So watching out for this, I think, is a very important factor, because what we see, and but also Massimo pointed to this, what we see is double dialectics. I think Brando talked about this sort of double public opinion, what we can see. We see a lot of populism in the system, but on the other side, we see a lot of European initiatives. By the way, there's also an Italian initiative with whom I'm affiliated, which is Europa Nova, Europe Now. And there's David Mattarello, an Italian MP behind, who also wrote the book Repubblica d'Europa. I invite you to read this book because it's a very good book. But my point here is that we have a deep crisis of representation in the European system, because there is a lot of populists about the Peace Party, whatever, the FPÖ and the Salvini. And they are trying to use the European system to torpedo the European system. But if you take aggregated data and you consult Europeans on what they want, and you go beyond your crisis of representation, because you do not ask with Eurobarometer the Italians or the Germans or the French or the Slovaks, because there's no such thing like the Italians, because there's Salvini Italians and the other Italians, there's Marine Le Pen French and the other French, there's Pegida Germans and non-Pegida Germans. Yeah, so what does it mean today to be a German? If we be this, you could easily argue that we have stable majorities in Europe, 2/3 majorities, to become European citizens and to want things like a European unemployment scheme or European basic income. For instance, there was University of Oxford polling European citizens in April 2020, and 72% of European citizens, if you ask them independently from origin, would support a European basic income. And all these things point to Mrs. von der Leyen's plans to increase the social pillar. The very fact that we need a European unemployment scheme is actually discussed in the European trilogy system these days. And also a stable majority of European citizens is or would be in favor of a European unemployment scheme. So my point is that we need to hold this discussion on the future of Europe and the fact whether we become United States of Europe, we need to shift it away from the states as main actors who are acting council and acting torpedoing the European Union. We need to shift that system to the European citizens. As citizens, now you are Italian citizen, I guess most in the virtual room here. I'm a German citizen. Actually, I have 2 sons who are living in Paris. They are French citizens. But the real question, what we need to work on, that would be my suggestion, and also closing this little intervention, that we start to call for a European full-fledged citizenship, which gives us what the French sociologue Pierre Rosanvallon calls the sacred of citizenship, le sacre du citoyen. The sacre du citoyen, the sacred of citizenship, means equal voting, equal taxation. We would break so the principle of no taxation without representation, and equal access to social rights. I repeat, equal voting, equal taxation, and equal access to social rights. If at these 3 things, say a European basic income or European unemployment scheme, we would go the traps that the European system holds today, which is no fiscal union, which is no social union, and which is a deep crisis of representation, because we are only represented as aggregation. Although the countries are deeply split. So my point is that if we would be claiming for European passport or full European citizenship, and European citizenship as permanent status, then what would we get? We would get the basis for European democracy, because democracy needs the principal political equality of all the being in that democracy. If you are in Italy today, whether you are in Milano or in Napoli, perhaps you do not share the same dialect, and you have differences in languages and differences in culture and different kitchens from north to south Italy. But what you share as citizens of the Italian Republic, of the Repubblica d'Italiana, is that you share equal rights. And the same France, the Corrs and the Bretons in France do not share culture and identity, but what they share is equal rights. They get the same unemployment scheme. And same for me. I'm in Germany, I'm from Rhineland, from Düsseldorf. I do not necessarily share the identity with the Bavarians or those in Berlin, but what I share is equal rights when it comes to taxation, to voting, and to the access of social rights. And I could imagine that we should, and that we should claim for, that we want to have equal rights in these key things, what Pierre-Rosan Vallon calls the sacred of citizenship. If we were to do so, and that is essentially my last sentence, we would perhaps no longer be striving for United States of Europe, because we shift the actorship of European integration to the European citizens. States have been doing integration. They have been with the single market and the euro. But integration is basically finished. We do have more or less fully integrated economies, and we do share the same currency. And a currency, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau would say, a currency is already a contrat social. The only thing we need now in Europe is that we need a European democracy. But in a European democracy, it's no longer the states who are the actors, it's the citizens. And therefore, I invite you to rethink the paradigm of United States of Europe, and I want you to reflect on to become a citizen of the European Republic, because Cicero, the philosopher Cicero, said 2,000 years ago, those citizens who, independently of origin and identity, decide to go under equal law, they become the member of the same republic. And so I would suggest that the time has come with the pandemic, with the need for overcome the crisis of political representation, with the need to build a social pillar, that we shift the whole discourse from United States of Europe to European Republic, and we argue on the similarity of European citizenship. And then perhaps we could end up in a very different Europe when we come out together out of this crisis. This, by the way, is the side of my little institute. So if you want to support this initiative, you can sign up for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We are really late. I asked the organizer to buy some more time. We should have closed by 10:45 at the latest, but I really want to hear Professor Piga and about.
No, Gilberto, go ahead. We have 5 minutes. I would prefer that the students, they always have a lot of questions. Let them give two or three questions if there are. It's much better. I have many opportunities to address them on these topics. Don't worry about me. It's important that students speak.
I just ask you at least one sentence on your book, Gustavo, really.
One sentence is that we have a lot to learn from, as you said, you introduced my book perfectly, because if you study the history of the United States, you will see that the debate has already been there, that there's a lot to learn from it. There was a huge debate between the so-called federalist and anti-federalist, and that it takes time, and that all the things that we heard today, in my opinion, lack this idea that culture matters and that it takes centuries to move to centralization. This is what, and so the key point is, how do we buy time? How do we make it so that time doesn't ruin us, but leads us slowly towards United States of Europe? But I see Giulio and Giovanni already have questions. Gilberto, go ahead with them.
I'm not sure we can have so much time for questions, but if say one of you as students have a question, I just ask you to make it. So please.
I was unmuted. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Giulio Croce and I'm a GG2 student, so a student of the second year in global governance. And my question for the panel in brief is whether we can achieve a federal integration among the states of the European Union only through the exclusion of those who are working against it. So I don't know, maybe the frugal forces or the Visegrad Pact countries, or if we can actually achieve an integration among the countries that actually wants it without excluding in the European Union as an international organization also the other countries. I don't know if I was clear. Thank you.
You were clear. Actually, I'll just turn your question to your Professor Piga first.
Again, let's use the guest. Ulrike can answer to that. I think it's a wonderful question.
Okay.
Well, you know, truly, I mean, if I look at the next generation Europe, basically at you, yeah, I think the chance we have truly to shift the discourse away from states. We need to stop reasoning in states. Because the states are creating the problem of representation, the states are creating the problem of basically no action in favor of Europe. So again, I think that the leverage to rethink the institutional setup is to start with the citizens and to have massive action in the conference that Ursula von der Leyen is now proposing, and that we intervene in this conference to basically build a European democracy on the basis of political equality. I think that we should strive for. I think this is doable, but it would go beyond the current sort of framing and beyond the current discourse of what we have.
I don't know if Massimo wants to reply on this question here. There is another question.
I lost the communication. I mean, I unfortunately I was cut off at the very last time.
All right. So there is another question. Let's do this question also for Professor Guerrero. Is about the unanimity rule. Do you think the unanimity rule should be abolished? And as with so many other common policies, a system of majority voting should be introduced so that the high representative for the Union's foreign policy can speak with one voice. I think it goes along the lines of your talk.
Look, if you ask me, yes, the rule of unanimity should be abandoned. And it's also what I call, in the meantime, old talk. Yeah, like all this sort of, we need Franco-German tandem or Franco-German engine and unanimity rule. All this is basically yesterday's talk. We are now in a very crucial pandemic situation, together in, together out. And the three requests I have is full parliamentarization of the system, full democratization of the system, basically abolishment of the council, and the principle of political equality for all European citizens. I think this is the chance we have. I think to some extent it's realistic. If you look in the paper of the German EU presidency, there is something like a European unemployment scheme already designed. We have now all the money that Mrs. von der Leyen have with the rescue package. There is a huge paragraph in the State of the Union speech of Mrs. von der Leyen on social capacity. And if you reason, but that is my point, I'm a political scientist, if we really want the European democracy, that is what we are all talking about, European democracy. And if we want to have something like a European citizenship, we are always talking about European citizens, then I have one single quest, which is, let us really be European citizens, period. We are not European citizens as long as you are Italian citizens, I'm German citizen, my sons are French citizens, and we are divided by different voting schemes, different representation, different social schemes, and different taxation. If we overcome this, because we are building a European democracy based on citizens' sovereignty, then we have a chance. And if you read the discourses from Emmanuel Macron, for instance, in the past 2 years, he would always go unité européenne, démocratie européenne, souveraineté européenne. And I think this accounts for all policy fields, be that in the foreign policy, be this for the emancipation of Europe between the US and China, be it for what we call the digitalization agenda, because we obviously need the servers from the GAFA complex in Europe to be independent and autonomous, and all these things. So yes, we need to go over veto rights, and we need to go over unanimity rule. It's obvious.
Right. I'm not sure we can go on. I'll just ask to the organizers whether we have some more time.
We have time for just a last question, please.
Right. So I'll just call Marinali Davide, who raises his hands. If he's here and can. Right. We see you, but we cannot hear you. You need to switch your mic off.
You have his question on the Zoom, anyway.
Do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. I wrote my question on the chat, but of course I can read it. I hope you will hear me because I have problem with the micro. First of all, it has been very interesting, this meeting, very full of ideas and proposed. Do you think, I have two questions. Do you think that the creation of the European Federation, or at least a reinforcement of the European, can start from a common foreign policy? So, for example, face the international issue or face the international power together? And secondly, I would like to ask if the plan in order to unify Europe, in order to create a federal union, can also have to pass through the extreme choice to exclude the countries as Poland, as Ukraine, so the country of the Visegrad group, that are the country that more of the other try to avoid this type of unification. I hope I am clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will, very unfortunately, I will need to leave basically in 2 minutes, but my very short answer is, again, states do foreign policy. And whether states will be able to unite on foreign policy or not, I wouldn't know, because states have been trying to do European foreign policy since, say, 30 years, and it wasn't pretty successful. I worked for Jacques Delors in the 90s. Somebody said it, we are no longer living in the European Union of the 90s, it's over. So if you look in detail at the European defense and security policy, there's not much going on. If you look at our weakness with respect to Russia, with respect to China, Syria, whatever, I'm not so over optimistic. So I personally, if you ask me, I would not argue, although I would like to see a common foreign policy, I would not think that the foreign policy is the trigger for a more united Europe. I repeat that if we want, as actors, we as citizens, we want to become the actor for a different, democratic, united and social Europe, then us as actors, we need to strive for what touches us, which is equal rights. The states can do foreign policy. I would love them to do so, but I wouldn't wait for the states to do a common European foreign policy. You understand? I would like to shift the mechanics of how we build democratic Europe away from the states and to what concerns us. And what concerns us is the basis of a democracy, and it starts with rights. And I'm very sorry, but I will need to run because I have a train.
No. We are very late, and I think with your sentence here, we can finish up our meeting of today. I think it was really interesting. I personally learned a lot of new things. I'll just apologize with Gustavo for not being able to have time for.
It was a great debate. Don't worry at all.
Thanks a lot again to everybody, and see you next time for discussing this, which are very important issues for the future of all of us. Thanks
Viva
a
la
lot.
Repubblica d'Europa.
Goodbye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.